Well, good afternoon. It's great to be here. I'm so pleased that Narendra has asked me back, and I feel, though, a little bit like the fifth husband of that Hollywood starlet that on his wedding night knew exactly what he was supposed to do, but he didn't know how to make it interesting. So I'm going to try to make it interesting. And last year we talked about President Trump, and that made it interesting to some degree, and I'm sure that'll be a part of it this time as well. Last year at the end of my presentation, Narendra said to me, "Aren't you straining to find something good to say about Trump becoming president?" Well, perhaps, but I'd like to make two overarching points. One, the advent of the Trump administration has opened up the path to greater cooperation in the strategically important area of oil and gas. Engagement in this crucial area has the power to bring the U.S. and India closer together. However, unfortunately, strategic considerations, not the least of which are sanctions, which we'll talk about in a minute, have also brought oil and gas to the forefront of challenges to the U.S.-India partnership. The second point is that the Trump administration emphasis on fossil fuels has led to announced withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and thus left the U.S. and India struggling to find a common way forward on pollution and climate change in conjunction with energy. This does not augur well for what happens to the U.S.-India energy agenda on renewable energy and sustainable growth, although it still provides scope for progress on power, energy efficiency, and even the long-delayed dream of civil nuclear engagement. Now, there have been some changes since we met last year. Mr. Rex Tillerson, who had been the head of ExxonMobil, is no longer the Secretary of State. Scott Pruitt from Oklahoma, who was head of the EPA, is not there anymore. But rest assured that oil and gas is still in the driver's seat. For example, the Secretary of Energy is still Rick Perry, who used to be the governor of Texas. And as you heard from Mr. Rystad this morning, it won't be long before Texas, the one state of Texas, will be a greater oil and gas producer than Saudi Arabia, just one state out of the 50. So you can see that there is very much an incentive there. In fact, that we have that the United States remains the world's top producer of petroleum and natural gas hydrates. And that is only going to be a situation which continues. As you probably know already, that has started to produce a flow between the United States and India. GAIL has signed a deal to buy 3.5 million tons a year of LNG for 20 years from Cheniere. The first delivery was made March the 30th, and I understand there have been two more since then. The Indian ambassador to the United States just participated in the opening of Dominion Energy's Cove Point liquefaction plant. There is a booking for another 2.3 million tons from that plant. In support of gas sales, U.S.-India Natural Gas Task Force has been set up to support India's, quote, vision for natural gas in the economy of India. And I would hasten to add to that a lot of the action is going to be at the state level, because you've heard that constraints are infrastructure, and Indian states play a great role in that, as do U.S. states. And at my own Center for Strategic and International Studies, we have an initiative at the state level. And so you shouldn't just think about this in terms of U.S. and India national governments, but the state governments are very instrumental as well. On the oil side, the U.S. is already becoming a major crude exporter, sending 1.76 million barrels per day abroad in April. And all told, producers and traders in the United States sent more than 15 million barrels of U.S. crude to India this year through July, compared with 8 million barrels in all of 2017. So there's great scope for the cooperation in this very crucial area, which is one point in the Strategic Energy Agreement, which was signed last year between Secretary Perry and Minister Pradhan. I think it's very significant that that agreement was signed with the Minister for Petroleum and other ministries which you might expect to be involved were not signatories to that agreement. Now, that is a part of the good news. The bad news, if you will, or not so good news, is the question of what is going to happen in regard to third-party sanctions, which the Trump administration has brought on itself in regard to Iran. As you may know, the Trump administration has put out a statement, edict if you will, saying that nations that deal with Iran and petroleum need to go to zero by November 4. Now, in regard to India, I don't think there's anybody here who thinks that that's very realistic. Being that Iran has supplied about 10% of oil needs, is the second or third, depending on the time period, in terms of supply. Now, fortunately, there are discussions going on, and some say, well, this is just like it was in the Obama administration, and that it will be overcome. We have other questions in that regard, which are similar in regard to the so-called CAATSA sanctions against Russia, and in regard to tariffs, as to which there is a threat of retaliation from India in regard to tariffs. In the remaining time, let me just say a couple of words about withdrawal from the Paris Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is complicating all the rest of the so-called 4 pillars of the strategic agreement between the U.S. and India. In regard to that, the Paris Agreement, you can see 180 parties ratified of 197, and now there's one that has withdrawn, which is my own government. Even if you look at coal, where there has been an upswing of exports from the United States, the question remains then, how do you deal with climate change and environment? The same goes for the renewable energy and sustainable growth pillar, the power and energy efficiency pillar of this agreement. The question really is not, are you going to interact in any of these areas? The question is, how will the U.S. and India be able to integrate in terms of a common approach both the environmental and climate change issues, along with those needs to provide affordable energy to the common man and woman, the Am Admi, if you will, in regard to being able to have economic development. One word about civil nuclear. Both sides are in favor of the Westinghouse civil nuclear project in Covada, but there is a great concern as to how this possibly can be financed in view of the fact that Westinghouse has had grave difficulties in being able to get its finances in order after having had great cost overruns in 2 new nuclear power projects in the United States. In concluding this part of my presentation, I want to show the natural gas advantage in regard to climate change and pollution. And all you have to do is look at the figures on carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, NOx, nitrous oxide, SOx, sulfur dioxide, particulates, and mercury, and you can see the advantage of natural gas over coal. In the United States, the shift is on to renewables plus the backup of natural gas. And this is the way in which we need to be able to go. You also saw earlier today that India, unlike China and others, is continuing, in spite of the Modi government understanding the need to move forward on both climate, environment, and in conjunction with energy. There's still this reliance on coal, and the question is not, are you going to have coal as a part of the mix, but what are you going to do to ameliorate the problems that we saw in terms of its greater pollution and effect on humankind. In conclusion, it's perfectly obvious that energy engagement can be a positive driver in strengthening the U.S.-India partnership. I would submit that the strongest bilateral relationship ought to be between these 2 largest democracies in the world. But this is not going to happen without a lot of attention from both sides in terms of being able to move forward in an environmentally responsible way to provide affordable energy to the common man and woman, both in the United States and in India. Thank you very much.